All right, we are live, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Break the Rules live stream. I am your humble host, Lev Polyakov at LevPo on Twitter, and we have two people who appeared on Break the Rules before, but never together, and this makes it an incredibly special stream. I would have never expected these two to be in the same virtual room, but here we have it. We have the great and powerful Vladislav Davidzon, who is a fellow of the Atlantic Council, mind you, and also writes for such publications as Foreign Policy Magazine. And we have the information trafficker Drutang joining us today. And you are a prolific writer, esotericist, Twitter personality. And today we are going to be combining these two very different worlds into one, where we're talking about the elites. What are the motivations for the elites? Is it just stupidity and going with the wokeness flow of today, or is that just the outside appearance and inside is much more sinister and planned out? So we're going to be talking about that. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, smash that like button, and also share this with all of your loved ones, including your pets. We're going to start with Vladislav. What is your take on what is currently going on? I know that you are not the biggest fan of what's going on with the elites today, and let's just get right into it.
Great. Thanks for having me, Lev. Big fan. You're a good man. You're a bright man. I like listening to you. I like spending time with you. I like the whole thing. So first of all, I'm live streaming into you from my apartment in central Paris. Bookshops,
Hmm.
books behind me. In my ensemble, just came back from teaching. I have to say, this is a set piece where you have one gentleman wearing a hoodie and the other gentleman wearing basically a turtleneck and a silk handkerchief and a tweed coat. And this is ideological framing, right? I am, in some ways, a member of the elite, if anyone it can be said to be part of the elite. It's like 10 years ago, people would say, I'm not a hipster. I'm not a hipster. There's no such thing as hipsters, really. They would have conferences and little literary magazine periodical gab fest about what is the hipster, what was the hipster, what was the Western political elite, what is someone who is a member of the quote unquote blob. Someone ringing in. Did you hear that, Lev?
Yes, I did. That's probably your handlers calling in to make sure that you are towing the line. But go on, Vlad.
It's funny. We should have a conversation about that. I do. I am tolerated because of my intelligence and my language skills and my connections and my publications and my connections in Ukraine and Russia and the many things for which they've credentialed me and they tolerate me and they like me, but they don't. They don't really trust me. I wouldn't say that they
Hmm.
really trust me.
Wait, so,
I'm the
so just to be
corporate.
clear, okay, you know Zelensky, you know like the whole crew.
At dinner with Zelensky. I won't say I haven't.
There we go.
Look, I'm a member of. I'm a fellow at the Atlantic Council. So all these Twitter idiots, left and right, idiocy is bipartisan.
Hundred
And
percent.
idiocy is universal. Doesn't have a partisan tinge to it. It doesn't have a party. It doesn't have a groupsicle to it. Idiocy is everywhere. A lot of people think that just because you're a fellow at the Atlantic Council, you have connections to this think tank, or you're hanging out at the Council of Foreign Relations, that you are a automatically set within one set of paradigms. There is a lot of bureaucracy and there's a lot of groupthink, and we are in a time of groupthink, oddly more now than 20, 30 years ago. And we'll get back to that. I will start with this. It is manifestly, for me, obviously, the case, manifestly obvious to me that is the case. Watching Western elites, and I do watch Western elites, and I do spend time with Western elites in Ukraine, Russians abroad, in the UK, in France, in America. I was just in London this week. I saw three members of the House of Lords on Wednesday. One for lunch, one at his house for drinks, and one for dinner at Westminster Parliament. I observe the elites very closely. They are not what they used to be. Western elite are degenerated. Not the three gentlemen, you know who you are, who I had dinner with on Tuesday, but others amongst you, in Washington D.C. in Washington, D.C. policy apparatus, in the State Department, in the think tanks, in the think tank world, in elite publishing, in the elite structures of the Western world, Western elites are not what they used to be. There has been a noticeable and serious degradation of Western elites over the last 25 to 30 years. That is the thesis. Let's continue on from that.
All right, Drew. Now I know that you attributed certain things going on with with the giants whose shoulders today's crop of elites are standing on. But would you say that among those who are not as well versed in the art of eliteness, you are still having enough people who are doing enough conscious damage to the world as opposed to just running on the fumes of whatever they think is for the benefit of mankind and is socially good and all that?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I think importantly, to set up the conversation as far as what I see as the reality of the elites, and I think I agree that they've degenerated, especially as in all systems with a lot of nepotism. When you're not operating in a meritocracy in that regard, there's obviously degeneration. What I see happening, and why I'm on that side of the duality here, where I would say there are some conscious objectives and plans playing out. I would say, I mean, they're very basic, and I don't even know if Vlad would disagree with me, but I know obviously throughout history, everybody always wants to centralize power. There's always been a conqueror, whether it be Napoleon or Hitler, or going back to, Alexander the Great. All these, each century or so has a conqueror that wants to take over the world as much as possible. And I think that's never stopped. I think there's always, anytime there's power, they want to continue to try and centralize it in as many ways as possible. How I see that happening today, of course, is I see historically, we had the world wars, which kind of broke down boundaries, and then ended up making the U.S. very powerful. Then there was two superpowers. You have Russia and the U.S., and then you have now effectively one. And we keep trending towards more and more centralization of power. Even though globalization makes a global economy, we still ended up with one superpower. And as far as the apparatuses to implement that or the control, I see, I see the Rockefellers pushing for instance, they gave the headquarters to the United Nations in New York on their property, and through the Rockefeller Foundation have funded various initiatives throughout the world. But yeah, I see constantly a lot of it's always about centralization power from my perspective. Especially I see a lot of the wars that the U.S. considers wars on terror. Obviously I don't think it's controversial again to say that oil has a lot to do with a lot of that, controlling the oil supply due to the U.S. petrodollar, to maintain our dominance, which is now being threatened in this Ukraine war, with Russia and China gaining, starting to cooperate more. So I see some decentralization there. But yeah, I'm just interested to try and find out where we disagree, because again, we did chat a bit before, and there were some slight disagreements, I'd say. But I'm interested to see what your opinion on of certain things. So I think we had mentioned the Iraq War, and that's just one of the things on my topic list. I'm wondering on, as we're now 20 years out from the beginning of that war, what were your perspectives, and what do you see as, and again, we had this conversation a little bit, but do you see the push, which now it's pretty much universally agreed that war was started on false pretenses? do you see this is, I think, a good example? Do you think it was negligence and stupidity that the ruling class of the United States pushed us into that war where possibly 1 million Iraqis died? Again, that number is not, it's hard to count, but and a lot of profit was made for various companies like Halliburton, which we mentioned, which Cheney, used to run. But yeah, what's your opinion? Do you think it was just negligence, or do you think it was intentional?
Okay, let's unpack that. There's a lot of it, a lot to unpack. First of all, speaking of Rockefellers, I think we're getting to a crux of division between you and me. I believe that you are possibly going about these things in too personalistic a fashion. I do believe that particular elites and great men in history, the great men history thesis, have influence, but I believe more in let's call them grand narratives, right? Economics, decadence, historical laws, economic class interests, culture, economics. I believe economics is downstream of culture. I believe that laws of history in a big Hegelian way and in a smaller way are very important, that the political formatting of the infrastructure of a nation is very important, that the regional interests of elites are very important to understand the way they're formed. I believe that the institutions that form elites are very important. I believe it's important to understand the internal social structures and the tapestry of the structures that form elites. What are the qualities that are inculcated in new elites? I think that's more important to understand the world that we live in than the particular ideology, temperament, pathologies, ideology, whatever, of a particular ruling family, even one as wealthy and well connected as the Rockefellers. Again, uh, let's not use the words conspiracy theory, because that is in fact the heuristic for cutting off people who are in the bubble that managerial elites occupy, and elites who are kind of adults occupy, away from people who would be wearing a ideological sweatshirt or a hoodie in our conversation, right? I do not, I don't believe in saying no a priori to any idea. And when we say conspiracy theory, we're already culling what can be said from what cannot be said, closing the Overton window, et cetera, et cetera. So in this conversation, even though it's framed as a guy in, kind of a free thinking guy in a turtleneck and a sports coat with a silk handkerchief against a guy in a black hoodie somewhere, the anarchist against the system man. Although I prefer to be the anarchist than the system man, and to see the system man inside the anarchist, we're still going to have to look at big grand narratives. I don't believe that the personal, ideological, bureaucratic, temperamental vibe of the mid-level of the Gates Foundation is going to explain to us the world we live in. Although that's interesting, and it's not unimportant.
100%
ideology
agree.
are there to produce ideology. So I think unpacking that is very important. Let's start with that. Secondly, Iraq War. I marched against the Iraq War as an 18-year-old boy, exactly 20 years ago. It was obvious to me it was going to happen.
Props. That's impressive.
I was a boy. I organized against it. I marched in the 2003 big marches in March of 2003. It was exactly 20 years ago, and I was an 18-year-old boy, and I was already radically militant in my politics, and I was very interested in politics already. And obviously, it was an exciting time to be an 18-year-old in America, in New York City. So I was against it, and even as a fairly precocious, and I was fairly precocious 18-year-old, it was obvious to me it was going to be a disaster. Why it wasn't obvious to people who were 30 years older than me and in positions of power, I don't know. Was it done for oil? It wasn't done for oil like the first Kuwait war was done for. The first Iraq Kuwait war was done to control the oil infrastructure. The second one was about, the maintenance of American hegemony, is the maintenance of the supply of energy to the Europeans, even more than to the Americans. It was about control of the obviously the American power in the world is not just based on nuclear missiles, based on naval power, control of the shipping lanes. Right? Historically, America is a naval power. That is the obvious way for a country like America on its own continent with access to the Pacific and the Atlantic to project its power. Right? This is the American contributions, intellectual contributions to the intellectual history of military thought. All original American contributions to the history of intellectual history of military thought are in the sphere of naval power. Right? We know this, right?
Sure.
We don't argue that, right? I believe that America 20 years ago, one political party was captured by a utopian creed, just as the other political party is captured by a utopian political creed. I can ask my wife, my darling, my battery's dying. Can you bring me the charger so I don't have to get up? I believe that the Republican Party was captured by and let's not use the words cabal, because you're the one in the black hoodie, not me. It was captured by.
Don't get me too excited with those type of words.
Don't get me excited, man. The Republican Party was captured by an ideological stream, an ideological cohort, as opposed to cabal. When we say neoconservative, we don't just mean Jew, right? I hear this from my conservative friends all the time. They say neoconservative, and I know they mean Jew.
Yeah.
I mean,
Paul Wolfowitz and yeah.
20 years ago, that was the case. Now, when they call me a neoconservative, my old leftist friends in New York, when they call me a neoconservative, they just mean the wrong kind of Jew, right? So that little sociological sketch aside, it seemed to me obvious that at the time the Republican Party had been captured by a cohort of people who were, thinking about the world in a utopian, rigorously utopian and crazed fashion. The same way that you could look at the ideological cohorts who have captured the elite platforms of the Democratic Party now, although not the whole party, but basically the certain ideological.
Just to interject, I think so you're basically talking about, for instance, the think tank Project for the New American Century. Would you say the members of that think tank are kind of that cohort that you're that you're referring to?
I believe they closed it down around 2013 or something like that, or even 2017. But it was Krautheimer and Wolfowitz and all those people. Yeah.
And I could give another example, by the way, from Wolfowitz. In the July 2005 interview in The Atlantic, he talked about how he wanted a Western intervention to remove the shackles on democracy when it comes to all of these different regimes in the Middle East. And I still don't know, though, is this a genuine belief of somebody who wants this to happen, or is this just a mask being worn in order to then generate some other profit and to make use of this tragedy in some way? Because people can say all kinds of things. How do we know if it's the genuine article as opposed to just an illusion for the sake of justifying bad things that happen?
Look, I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, everywhere, from Iraq to Iran, from Egypt to Lebanon, Israel. I've been everywhere except Algeria, right? I've been everywhere except Algeria and Saudi Arabia. I've been all over the Middle East. It should have been obvious, and it was obvious to normatively not stupid American political elites, that you're buying off the governments of all these places to protect you from the people there who hate us, and by us I mean me, New York Jew. New York Jew, who's a member of the Atlantic Council. They don't, it's obvious that, I mean, in some places there's less anti-Americanism and anti-Western thought than others, but like a lot of people in the population of Egypt don't like the West. There are a lot of people in a place like Syria or a place like Iraq, and the Sunni, Syrian, Arab, not Arab, it doesn't matter. There are a lot of people in the Levant, the Middle East, who simply don't like, for actually historical reasons, completely understandably, the West or Americans or the British or British oil, whatever. And the point of the entire American diplomatic military infrastructure was to buy the elites off in these countries to protect ourselves from the populations who don't like us. More democracy in these places is not what you want if you are a kind of rational elite. This was the case before George W. Bush's Cowboys came into power, right? I mean, these are not politically correct things to say, but there are lots of people in the world, in these societies, which for various complex reasons, which we don't need to explain now, do not have democracy and don't have liberalism, and need democracy even less than they need liberalism, right? And you shouldn't have democracy there before you have liberalism. So if you're like a properly rational elite of the old school, why would you want to have, why would you want more democratic input from the Egyptian population on what relations with America, Europe, and Israel are going to be like? You don't, right? So these neoconservatives, they are operating on delusional ideological ideals, and they believe them. And they also, I think, some of them believe that what's good for whichever company that they're aligned with is good for America. I really do believe it. I believe that people like Dick Cheney should be distinguished from the neoconservatives, right? But I think he did believe that what was good for Halliburton was good for America, right? In the same way that reasonable, rational 1950s elites believe that what's good for Ford and good for GM is good for America.
Okay, so on that point, I think this is what I'm trying to distinguish here is what exactly, because we're talking about the elites and corruption and stuff like that. I'm trying to figure out where the moral line here is, because I see, of course, I see Cheney and of course his connections with Halliburton, which profited heavily off of the Iraq War, which we now know is started on false pretenses. I look at that and see Cheney knew.
Can I just interrupt very quickly? I'm sorry, I forgot to end it. I know Judy Miller very well. She's a close friend. Judy Miller is a close friend. I like her very much. She's been very supportive of my work and of my journalism. Judy Miller, I think, is a noble person who did good work and was lied to. And when I asked her, and I personally asked Judy Miller about the evidence, she told me that she got lied to by people in the intelligence services. So make that what you will. I actually went and I asked Judy Miller about the evidence for WMD. That's a fucking connection to the elites, man. Like, I asked.
There is another thing, by the way, regarding the WMDs that I heard, but I have yet to research. That Vladimir Putin was also giving certain hints about there being WMDs in Iraq to the United States government, and I wonder how much that was the time of, I looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul when it comes to George W. Bush, and whether there may have been some malfeasance when it comes to maybe tricking certain naive people that way by the Russian government. Is this stretching? Is this not something?
I don't think we're going to give a gentleman his turn to talk in a second. First of all, I don't think they needed to be tricked. They were looking for what they were looking for, and anyone who played up to whatever they was looking for, I don't think they needed to be tricked or manipulated by the Russians at the time, who were very happy to go on board, because terrorism and Middle East terrorism, Islamic terrorism, is a big problem for the Russian Federation. Putin really thought that he could have a really fruitful coalition situation at the beginning with the Americans, that they had mutual interests. His feelings were really hurt. He has real grievances in the sense that they're not legitimate. I'm a Ukrainian patriot and all that, but he has real, as in they actually exist, grievances, as in a man whose feelings were hurt and who feels rejected. Does that make sense? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Drew.
So yeah. Just on that same, on the same note, just because I think Iraq is really nice, and I think, it's not really nice, but I think it's a good subject to talk about because, and this is kind of, again, going back to some of our earlier conversations, why I think it's so important to talk about the past is because as things happen in the present, there's the fog of war. So we don't exactly know what's going on until we can look in retrospect, and we can get a few FOIA requests and get a few documents released that otherwise we would have never seen. As far as the Iraq War, earlier, just an earlier point that I'd written down, when I said when I mentioned about the gas, according to my understanding, I believe Saddam was about to start, and you did kind of mention this, I think, but he was about to start selling his gas in euros to the European nations, which, you know, I see as definitely an aspect of, you know, maintaining control of the petrodollar. But that's a bit of a side note. On the starting it under false pretenses, and kind of why I see this as a great example of why I see the elites as not incompetent, but actually completely, well, you know, and when I say elites, I think this is another important distinction. Like you were saying, you know, you talk to people who are, you know, who were lied to by the intelligence agency. So, you know, in good faith, they're just trying to do their jobs and act in the best interest of the country. When I refer to
Miller of intelligence services,
what's that?
are you talking about Judy Miller or the intelligence services?
The intelligence
I was talking
services.
Lying to her.
Okay, okay, fine. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So what I'm referring to in those instances is, of course, there's the mid-level and lower people in these certain government offices and stuff. They don't, you know, all you can do is rely on what your intelligence agencies are telling you. What I see, though, of course, when we talk about the Bush cohorts, obviously the Bush family is very heavily involved in the intelligence agencies themselves, with, of course, George Bush Sr. running the CIA at one point.
Right.
So those, when I'm referring to the elites having malevolent ambitions, I'd be referring to, say, the intelligence agencies who were lying to the people underneath who would have, you know, otherwise good intentions. I think in terms of the Iraq War, another just I have a link here to a video, an interview with on Democracy Now! With General Wesley Clark, where he says that pretty much immediately after 9/11, he was told by the higher ups that they already had a list of 7 countries that they wanted to invade, knowing that there was no connection between what happened and
Iraq,
and these
Syria.
countries. Yeah. And I dropped the link in the chat there, and then I have of course the Robert Mueller talking about telling everybody that there were WMDs in Iraq, but yeah, that's the type of thing I'm referring to. I see when I'm referring to elites and saying that they are not just ignorant or, you know, incompetent, and they have malevolent intentions for self-gain. This is exactly what I'm talking about, where something happens, an event like 9/11 happens, and then they're able to use it to their advantage in order to start wars that that profit them and centralize power. And especially, we're talking again about the cohort and the project for the new American century. And specifically in their report, I believe in the year 2000, they specifically said, you know, these wars that we want to start to centralize power and maintain American dominance, it's going to be hard to get the public behind them without some type of, and of course I'm quoting, a new Pearl Harbor. So I see them not only are they, you know, something bad happened and then they used it to their advantage. I see them specifically and very intelligently, and not out of ignorance or opulence. They know exactly what they want to do, and given the opportunity, they're willing to kill 1 million people in order to profit and centralize power. So that's the thesis of my one good example, I think, of the elite actually being very competent and able to pull it off. And I think that one of the main reasons they were able to pull it off, to your point, which you're talking about being a young man who protested against the Iraq War, which again, massive props on that. That's awesome. That's so cool to have stood against that. As I see a lot of, I see what I do as, hopefully in that same vein of trying to get the public's opinion going the correct direction and away from propaganda and stuff like that. And I think that is another part of the apparatus that I see as very, very intelligent, not negligent at all, is the control over the media. And of course, in the time of the Iraq War, they, for instance, I believe it was NBC kicked one of their reporters off for, oh yeah, here we go. Phil Donahue on MSNBC was kicked off because he was saying that the Iraq War was not justified and then that we shouldn't do it. So that's
media. All right, go ahead. I just don't think there's any centralized control of the media. I don't.
So why do you think that? Why do you think that they fired dissidents of the Iraq War? Do you think that there was connections between the same people who lied about the reasons we went and killed 1 million people and the people who fired actors or fired voices on the mainstream that were trying to warn people that it wasn't a good idea to go into the war? There's no connection there?
Look, I don't remember that happening. I honestly don't. If I did, I would say it now. I just don't remember that happening. If I went back and looked through what happened, probably I would know more.
Okay, I have another link here to a video, interview with Phil Donahue talking about exactly what happened.
But I guess I don't want to speak for Vlad, but the vibe that I'm getting is that a lot of these things that you mentioned, they could potentially also be attributed to the same reason why you have somebody in California, New York, supporting various transgender-oriented programs, even though they don't know each other. There may be certain things in the air that get people to be against those who would question the war in Iraq, for example, at that time. That does not necessarily mean they know each other. But to Drew's point, though, when it comes to this intelligence apparatus that let Judith Miller know certain things, the question is how many people could potentially, and where the evidence is for that, be able to direct certain things in their favor from more of a malicious point of view, as opposed to a more, we want to spread democracy in the Middle East, and you know what I mean? Like, those people, how many of those?
Saddam Hussein was a problem. I mean, like I was just on a podcast with my wonderful friend Claire Berlinski, and we were having the same exact argument about Iraq and Ukraine 20 years later. And actually, I had to explain to my Ukrainian wife why this is important. She's like, I don't understand. Why does Iraq have anything to do with now? I said, oh, darling, I have a lot to explain to you. I explained this to my Ukrainian wife, why this is why understanding that is important for understanding what's going on now. Why there are people who are skeptical of Ukraine now when a lot of the arguments sound not dissimilar. But again, it's not the case that we discussed this with Claire, that Hussein wasn't a real problem. He was a real serious geopolitical problem. There were all sorts of conversations, arguments about what to do with him, how to contain him, how to box him in. Was he really? I mean, there were arguments which were legitimate. They sounded
and the U.S. did help him come to power. Am I correct in saying that?
I mean, we have receipts for that. I mean, all sorts of stuff happens where Americans do something and then there is blowback 20, 30, 40 years later. I mean, this is the history of American tinkering with the world. Let's use that word.
Yeah,
tinkering.
Osama bin Laden and the USSR and all that. Yeah,
we can agree till the cows come home. They're already home. The cows. We agree with them. The cows, right? What color are the cows? Black, white, gray, and gray cows. It's the case that happens over and over again. In fact, events are contingent, and all sorts of stuff happens. You can't predict the future because the future is very difficult to predict. Things are messy. People are messy. People are irrational. People believe in all sorts of psychotic nonsense. Economic incentives don't always make people do what they're supposed to. People believe in all sorts of silly ideas. They behave like they're not supposed to behave. The popolo, they charge direction. All sorts of stuff happens. Whereas you make a decision and it has all sorts of repercussions, and then it's contingent. History is contingent, and the way that elites run events is mostly in reaction to where they are, as opposed to having some sort of massive conspiracy for where they can see the world going. So it was very much the case that Saddam Hussein was a geopolitical problem for a lot of people, and they did take the opportunity to get rid of him. And also, there's the psychological stuff. He tried to assassinate George Bush's father. There's a lot of psychological stuff that doesn't really fit into the oil for blood paradigm. All right, there's a lot. There's a lot there. There's a lot of unnecessary emotion and Freudian psychology involved, right? Where I don't believe that this gentleman's correct, that the economics and cupidity and evil actually explains everything. There's just a lot of unnecessarily hard to place emotional stuff there, right? Make sense?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so you're saying, even though the think tanks did, say if something like a new Pearl Harbor happened, we could use it to start these wars for our own benefit and profit. And then they happened, and then an event happened, and they were able to utilize it exactly how they wanted to. And then they had, in terms of the media that we brought up before,
right?
I think so. How much do you think the intelligence agencies have no influence over the mainstream media in the United States? Because I think historically,
they have a lot
that's
now. A lot now.
Okay.
Okay. Look,
okay. Well, how about what we found out
Operation Mockingbird?
The church committee hearings.
20 years.
Do you think that stopped?
20 years ago, you had a situation where the American elite legacy media still had its own center of gravity, which is no longer the case. The mating between the intelligence services and bureaucracies and the what's left of the legacy media in the wake of 2010, 2012, when the legacy media just collapsed, right? Where social media and the tech corporations just destroyed the old legacy media and their economic model, and then all sorts of bad stuff happened, and the legacy media went into some stupid directions and became partisan power verticals and made it to the intelligence services. That is a modern thing. That wasn't the case in 2000. Phil Donahue, when he got fired, as you're saying, and Judy Miller, my friend Judy Miller, 20 years ago, they were living in a vastly different media environment. The media environment now is radically different and radically more debased and radically lacking, much more lacking its lack of partisan thing that it was supposed to be running on. The media now and the media then are radically different creatures, radically different structures.
Just a quick question. There was the
Yes.
church committee that was investigating Operation Mockingbird back in the 1970s, right? So already back then there was this case of...
I have not been born yet in the Soviet Union. This is before my time, but go ahead, yes.
Okay, so this was the case, from what I understand, of
Right.
these relationships between the media outlets and these front organizations that were used to disseminate propaganda, where you had agents that came in there in order to influence things into a certain direction, and there was the whole church committee hearings about that, and it was revealed that the CIA engaged in these illegal and unethical activities.
Sure, this happened.
Yeah, so
Historically, this happened. It's not like it doesn't happen. But for the most part, the legacy elite media in America had their own center of gravity, which, when it was compromised, and it was occasionally compromised, was a compromise of norms. I'm making the argument now is that all those norms are out the window, and you have this really weird time where all the ex-spooks from the Obama administration are on TV on CNN as journalists, which is really weird, man. I go to the UK and I talk to members of the House of Lords and intelligence people, and like in France, this doesn't happen. There's always like a cooling off period, and then there are norms. Like you don't leave the Macron administration as the head of like CMDG or whatever, and then go on TV the next day as a talking head making $3 million a year from France 24. It doesn't happen. In the UK, former heads of MI5 or MI6, they go off to Oxford and they sit at Christ Church at high table and they smoke their pipe and they charm their little disciples, and they get drunk and give away state secrets at the table after a couple of drinks. They don't go on the BBC making £6 million a year. It's just a completely different thing. It's a ridiculous degeneration that Clapper and all these former spooks, heads of intelligence services, Obama and Trump administration immediately get jobs on Fox News and MSNBC. This is ridiculous. Like this is a new thing, you kids. This wasn't the case when I was growing up.
Well, it's definitely a higher level, but was there nothing of that sort at all during the time of the Iraq War, at least when it comes to certain prodding, when it comes to getting news reporters to say the right things? Because I would assume it would be pretty foolish for intelligence agencies not to make use of whatever opportunity there is there.
Agencies lie, man. The intelligence agencies lie, and that's their job. It's their job. We have an entire industry of misinformation, disinformation now, which tells people how to think. I think it's important to make a distinction between lying and misdirection, and using structural methods in order to get fools and rubes to get your message across. Very often now, like, I don't get information as a journalist, or my colleagues don't get information unless intelligence services, one of them, leaks something. Very often, most of what you see in the newspaper is because it's not like the journalists are so smart. It gets leaked to various people, and they check it, or they double check it, or they don't check it. But it's been released for one end or another. What you're talking about, which is a different category of elite control, is top-down control from the intelligence service and bureaucracies of, let's say, the Sulzberger family, where the intelligence services call up the owners of the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Financial Times, and they say, you have to do this or you have to do that. That's a completely different, like, Soviet-style level of control that doesn't really, to my mind, exist, or didn't exist when I was a kid. And there's just like a lot of people in elite circles now are, even if they're journalists, are actually operatives for the Democratic Party, right? They're like they believe that what they have to do is to make the Democratic Party win. So like they're more activists.
And this is similar with Twitter, let's say, with the whole Twitter files fiasco, where you had members of the intelligence community coming in there, and it's not like they were threatening, the lives of the family of the people, or else they wouldn't do it. It was just something that I guess was in the air.
This is in the Soviet Union. No one says, like, no one's gonna take jobs away from you. Like, the worst thing that happens in their circles, and it's important to them, is that their kids don't get to go to the right schools.
Yeah. Yet there wasn't any leaking before the Twitter files, from what I understand. I mean, isn't that interesting to think about? Like, you had all these years.
Actually, no. Like, it was obvious to me and people in my circles that people in Twitter we're talking to the intelligence services. It was obvious already with the Hunter Biden stuff.
I wanted to bring that up next.
First of all, I'm a Ukraine hand, and if you look around on the internet, I was actually a minor player in Ukraine Gate. I mean, I'm actually if you read Hunter Biden's Wikipedia page, I'm in there. I don't know if you know this.
No way. Did you get him the job at the gas company, or?
I wasn't like, no, I mean, I was like a federal witness about that stuff, right?
Okay.
CNN reported about that. This isn't a secret anymore. You could just Google Vladislav Davidzon and CNN.
Oh, here, it says over here, CNN reported that Vladislav Davidzon, the editor of Ukrainian magazine The Odessa Review, told CNN that in 2018, Telezhenko offered him money to lobby Republican senators in support of pro-Russian television stations in Ukraine.
I I knew about Hunter Biden in 2018, man. Like, it's all true. I mean, like, here's the thing. I mean, like, I'm a member of the Atlantic Council, and I know all the people on the Hill who work on Ukraine, and I was there. They like the people who were covering for were looking for information on Hunter Biden. Were trying to bribe me. I went to the feds with that. I was there, man. It's not like you can't tell me it's bullshit. I was there. I saw it with my own eyes.
No,
Like,
but look at it this way though. You and other people who are in the know are in the know. The people who are on 4chan or are like watching the more dissident networks, they're in the know. But the normies were not in the know, at least from what I understand. We have all those.
They were not in the know until very recently.
The PMCs I'm talking about, like the people who have respectable jobs in all kinds of industries in the U.S. They were dead sure that all of this was just a Russian psyop, and that no, you disagree.
I mean, that's true. Yeah, it was. Yeah, absolutely right. They were tricked. All those people, all those nice people, they were tricked by the nice people in the White House who were having nice conversations with the people in intelligence services, who were having nice conversations with the people on Twitter. Everything that Matt Taibbi put out is absolutely right. All these people like Mehdi Hassan who are trying to go after him are just party operatives, right? And here's the thing: I've never voted for Republican my entire life. Okay, just so you know.
Wow, the hoodie and the tweed suit are in 100% agreement. This is phenomenal.
This is the power of Break the Rules, everybody. Subscribe right now.
Here's the thing: I don't agree with this guy on the generative power of the Rockefellers to explain all this stuff. I don't, but I have not disagreed on anything yet, as far as I know.
Well, it's about time you should. So when we're talking about like the Rockefellers, I agree with you, Vlad, that there is this air of tradition that people take up, whether it's the normies who would disengage from any information that would be, let's say, pro-Trump or against Biden, as well as with the gender and critical race theory and all that stuff. Like, we understand that people fall into these cultural categories. But at the same time, there are also, I'm sure, very rich people out there who stand to make a lot of money from certain events throughout history, and it would be very foolish of them not to do whatever it is in their power in order to put money behind things that they think are going to work out. Would that be a stretch for me to say, or would you agree with that so far?
Look, I do believe a lot of the cultural churn that we're seeing in America, and it's zero. It's zero sum, because culture war really is zero sum. There's very little compromise to be made on these issues. It's very polarizing. A lot of it is bread and circuses to keep people from demanding, keeping people from demanding for more in a really diminishing an economy. America, for various structural reasons, the digital revolution, globalization. We're not going to go into why things are really bad, but things are really bad. 75% of the American electorate voted either for Donald Trump or for Bernie Sanders. Like 3 out of 4 Americans, not a particularly radical country, full of moderate people historically, for various reasons, moderate, nice people who want to make a living, and it's a capitalist country historically. They wanted either socialism, American socialism, or they wanted like social nationalism, right? As opposed to national socialism, right? They wanted either like some sort of retreat from the present into the past, or even weirder retreat into another kind of fantasia, right? What is Bernie Sanders? Return to Eugene Debs. What is Donald Trump? A return to kind of 1928 style Mussolini corporatist alliance of big business and the popolo, right? So these are two different fantasias of a past, which 3/4 of the population fled into, seeing how stupid and horrible their lives were, right? America screwed up. Like, instead of having a serious conversation about what is to be done with 80% of a population living worse than their parents did, we're having stupid conversations about trans rights, or about like, very stupid things, or like, gun rights or whatever. It's a lot of bread and circuses to distract the rubes from very serious tectonic shifts in the economy and the political economy of the country.
So just on that point, I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. With I wanted to get your perspective on it. With we did used to have an anti-war movement that was that the left supported heavily. Like I assume in the Iraq War there was actual legitimate pushback, and
Totally. I
a
was there, man.
movement.
Yeah, existed. Yeah, I was part of it.
So that obviously, that is not where the energy is in the dissident left or even any type of protest movement. And of course, when you're talking about the distractions from the economic disparities and the 2008 bank bailouts is, I think, a great example of that. And then, you had Occupy Wall Street, and then all of a sudden,
Nothing.
after that, it was just all BLM and then a whole
Identity
range of
stuff.
cultural issues.
Identity stuff, divisive tribal identity stuff from both
that corporations are all 100% behind constantly. And I think the only time we've ever seen any pushback really is recently with the Bud Light. I think they finally picked with the wrong demographic.
My man, there are some very, very, very responsible, very conservative, very reasonable, important people who had very big jobs in the State Department, in the Defense Department, who are in their 60s and 70s, in the Atlantic Council, in Brookings, in Cato, who agree with you. They're very serious, very intelligent, very, very, very rational people who have had security clearances, who do not disagree with you or me one bit. And just so you know, I think it's important to understand that.
But the disagreement, from what I'm understanding, still comes to whether, sure, we have these corporations that are just looking out for their own self-interest. That is very obvious. That's a very human thing. But beyond that, there would still, I imagine, be a certain layer, like an upper crust layer, of people who have so much money, they don't know what to do with it, but at the same time, they may be motivated in terms of a vision to the future that they consider to be correct. And you could also say, Vlad, that their vision of the future may be just as SJW-ish, for example, like the normies have, or it could be something else. And I think what Drew is getting at, the reason why, for example, we were talking before about the past and talking about how there were all these California eugenicists, whether it's the Rockefellers and so on, who supported Hitler and all that, people who are in these positions of power, their imagination may tend to run wild, and they may end up doing certain things that they think is going to, improve the race or whatever, or do certain things that normal people would find to absolutely abhorrent. And when you have a lot of time on your hands and a lot of privilege growing up as somebody who has everything that they ever wanted to have, I can just imagine that there would be people in that position that would see themselves as having some kind of a mission to fulfill. Maybe I'm aggrandizing it too much.
It doesn't work like that, man. Like, American elites work a lot. Like members of the American political elite, as in even people like in the Century Foundation, who I knew when I was like 18, 19. They just work really hard. It's like
I'm not saying they don't work hard. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying
privilege in America. It's like you have it now and then you have nothing, and like there's no class of Sybarites who sit around dreaming and pulling levers, man. They really have to hustle. American elites really hustle from the time they're young to when they compete very hard to get into law school, for when they grind out into the corporations. Like, American elites work really hard, and they work like donkeys, man. Like, it's not the same in France or Italy or other places. I mean, it's like it's just the portrait that you're painting of the aggregate of American elites, and we have to even describe what we're talking about elites. It's not commensurate with how hard they have to compete to keep their place in the system.
I'm not disagreeing, and I don't think Drew's disagreeing either, that these elites work hard, that they're not just sitting around munching on cookies all day while dreaming. But the difference, I think, is that when you're in a position when you know that whatever it is you do will have much higher ripple effects. We're not talking about a butterfly flapping its wings. We're talking about, Mothra or whatever, like we're talking about something much more high caliber when it comes to the decisions that you make.
Yeah.
At that point, when I see certain things, like, for example, and sorry to go all tinfoil hatted on you for a second, but there was this organization. Yes. There was this organization, Bohemian Grove, the Bohemian Club. It was started pretty interestingly. It was started by, that great American writer Samuel Clemens, aka. I remember his old name. Mark Twain. Thank you. Yes, it was started by Mark Twain. It was a bohemian, artsy fartsy organization. And then eventually you get people like David Gergen, who worked for the Clinton administration, who was caught on tape being very angry that Alex Jones revealed that he attended this Bohemian Grove meeting where they were like wearing robes and stuff. And to me, I'm not gonna go and say like this is
doing
like,
a mock human sacrifice.
Look, these are socialization rituals for people who are already in the elite. This kind of stuff happens everywhere, and it's par of a course. Elites everywhere operate based on basic sociological principles. Rich people everywhere hang out together. Wealth leads to power, and power leads to wealth. Right? Unless there's actual some kind of proof of a charter of political ideas that you have to subscribe to before you put on the hoodie or the hood at Bohemian Grove, this is just like frat boy stuff for once you're already in. This is.
That's interesting that you bring that up, because that is on the same vein. One thing I wanted to get your opinion on to again see if we could find something to disagree with. So I think a really important power center in the U.S. is the Skull and Bones of Yale, the Skull and Bones Society in Yale.
Bush,
and
Kerry.
I think. Yeah, exactly. I believe was that 2004 when they ran against each other?
Yeah.
So having the two presidential candidates in the United States being
Dude,
part of the same group.
I'm a dirty immigrant. I went to CUNY before we had money. I went to CUNY. I did my graduate studies in Europe, man. I really went to CUNY. I'm a dirty immigrant, man. I didn't go to Yale. I don't know. I wasn't there. I know I have friends who went to Yale. I can ask them, but they don't talk about it. I have asked. They don't talk about it. They're not supposed to talk about it.
I think that's just, though, that example is just something where I would say it leads itself to the conclusion that there's a lot more coordination that's very conscious. If you have a very elite society like that.
There are elites who gravitate towards each other. There are social networks. Why do we overpay to send our kids to Harvard at like $250,000 a year? Why is sending a kid for like the Harvard, Yale, Stanford economic premium worth it?
The network
effect, right? Obviously, the connections, the network effect. Like if you go to parties, and some of those parties are more colorful than others, you get to meet kids who will be in elite positions in their sectors. That is not, to me, prima facie evidence of any kind of conspiracy other than the conspiracy of self-sorting by economic and prestige positions by people who are very, very ambitious, right?
Unless one thing I wanted to add is that it's also it's not just that it was Bush and Kerry, but it's it's generational. So Bush's father and Bush's grandfather Prescott, who got caught in the Trading with the Enemies Act, helping to fund the Nazis through the Union Bank. And then George Bush Sr., CIA. All
right. Well,
it's a generational thing, and institutions like the Skull and Bones help to make sure that the ideology and the generational goals stay relatively consistent. So that's where I derive my viewpoint of there being multi-generational goals, and specifically
social networks. Look, privilege does reproduce itself. These are people whose grandchildren and grandparents went to Harvard and Yale, and that's the way countries reproduce elites. I mean, I live in France, man. Like, if you want to see a aristocracy masquerading as a republic, come here.
Mhm.
You know, it'd be a lot worse than the American case. You know.
But when it comes to, let's say, something like Skull and Bones, we can take the very bone dry, pardon the pun, view of
Right.
all of this just being an excuse to socially network with people who are of your same social status. But
Right.
then we could, and maybe this is me reaching,
Right.
we could take the other view of, let's say, why were the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans, the elites, mind you, of that time, so interested in their mystery schools, so interested in becoming members of the Pythagorean order or various other cults that were appearing at that time? Why did you have, for example, Alexander the Great's teacher being Aristotle? Why did you have somebody like Plato being sent over to Syracuse after being kicked out several times over and over again to teach the king? I think that people who are in those positions, they're not just complete squares who are totally materialistic. I think that inside of some people there is a certain desire to know more about what this reality is, to know more about like what life is, and to also have a certain view of not just what you're doing right now to make as much money as possible and to do as much drugs as possible, but maybe to pass something on to the next generation. So again, these are just all assumptions. But
Well, let's. Okay, I will say that it's correct that healthy political elites, healthy martial elites, are not lacking in resources. It's actually it's within the British system. There are people who argue all the time, but it's important to have a wealthy, generationally wealthy elite that reproduces its wealth and its privilege in order to give them the space for psychological, intellectual growth, that they can have other characteristics, that they could be self-sufficient, self-sustaining, coherent. Those are arguments that you hear out in the open in an aristocracy or a country where class is very important. In America, it's these things are run by proxy. So American political elites, um, they are ripped up root and stem every 30-40 years. The country is continuously reinventing itself. So in some ways it's actually kind of silly that we're talking so much about the Bush people when those people will never be in power ever again, ever. Like it's the and the WASPs are out of power. Arguably the WASPs have reinvented themselves as the wokeists. It's the revenge of the the wokists. Is the revenge of the deracinated class WASPs. In America, your position in the elite is never very. I mean, look. I mean, the Bushes are the last generation of that kind of white America being in power. After that, you had a hillbilly, Southerner, a Baptist. I mean, he went to Oxford, but he's an outsider. And then you had Barack
heavily
Obama.
tied in with the Rockefellers, though.
And with
He followed.
Carol Quigley was a mentor of his who wrote a lot about all of these associations with the elites. Like, I wouldn't take Clinton as somebody who was
class, man. He wasn't a member of them, or he was a real outsider, right? He didn't.
But he did have an interest. That's the key here. Where with America, it's not like we have. You're absolutely right, Vlad. It's not like we have this aristocracy. What we do have, though, is, like you were saying, a certain mindset that people can embrace. And when you've embraced that mindset, maybe that makes you just like Augustus to Julius Caesar, where Augustus was not Julius Caesar's son, yet in the Roman Republic there was this tradition of adopting certain kids who you saw as being, who had the stuff to continue the tradition onwards.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, well, again, this is a question of how either elites are chosen or how they're reproduced, and those are two different questions.
So, just one thing, real quick, I wanted to bring up is you're right there. I doubt a Bush will ever take power again. But I think what's important to see here, and what I found in my own research into such topics, is that there's always there's a necessary rebrand. If you want to maintain your power within your group, you need to switch things up. People's brands go in and out of fashion. So with the Bushes, the Bush family, originally came to prominence because Samuel Bush, Prescott's father, worked for the Rockefellers at Buckeye Steel Company. So he got, he was very close with the Rockefellers, and then, they were all Skull and Bones, all these circles, and they, throughout time, they, the Bush family took over, and there was a vice president Rockefeller under, I forget who exactly, but yeah. So there's always a slight rebranding going on, and I think just to bring it to
That was Gerald Ford, by the way. That's here.
Yeah. Oh,
hello.
There goes Junior there.
Aw.
Hey, the next generation of a counter.
Exactly.
Everybody subscribe to empower Drew's next generation of the counter elite. But yeah, that was Nelson Rockefeller, and he was vice president under Gerald Ford from 74 to 77.
That's right, yes.
So then, so and to see, the power structure continue, you've got of course George Bush Sr. in the CIA, then his vice president, then his president, then of course you had the Clinton intermission.
Is that a conspiracy, or that's just the way elites reproduce, man? Is that a conspiracy?
Well, no, that's what I'm saying. It's I think that's the core of our disagreement, or whatever we think is a disagreement, is what I see as, I see certain objectives as morally bad, like what we were talking about with Cheney and Halliburton. I see orchestrating a war, or being prepared to take advantage of a situation to go into war, and then immediately going into it, having intelligence agencies come up with false reasons to go into it, and then killing 1 million people while you profit, even if you think it's patriotic or that, you're just trying to create a new American century. I see that as very bad and morally wrong. Just because Skull and Bones is there
are a lot of people who think it's morally wrong, including myself. Like if I was going to frame it that way, which I might. I also think it's very wrong, and it's also even more than that. It's counterproductive. It's even worse because America went through a historic decline because the foreign policy of America was it was for a generation. For in fact 4 presidential terms, 2 Bush and 2 Obama, the American foreign policy was radically bad. It was stupid. The smart, quote unquote, smart kids in the Obama administration were probably even stupider in the ideas that they were following in the Middle East than the dumb kids, the stupid kids in the Bush administration.
Well, yeah, that's a great example as well, though, the Bush to Obama transition, because I believe there's now leaked or FOIA documents that show that the intelligence agencies were specifically using Obama's reputation in order to get Europe and the rest of the world on board with our other interventions, which Obama, of course, got us involved in 5 additional interventions. Libya in particular.
He led from behind. He tried not to do that. I mean, that was Libya was an understandable thing. Libya was not a great thing, but it was an understandable thing compared to other. I follow Michael Walzer teaching on this a lot. The kid is not liking our thinking.
Wait, hold on, Drew. The baby is adorable. I would just mute for a second right now.
Yeah. Sorry.
Speaking, no problem. But everybody, subscribe for the sake of that beautiful little baby. So anyway, Vlad, you were saying.
Again, man, like the Obama administration was isolationist. Then you had Trump, who had basically the same instincts, except less elegant and less sentimental about the world. And then you have Biden now, who would also have preferred a smaller American footprint in the world. You have actually the 4th, presidential term in a row of someone who wants a smaller American footprint in the world. I don't know what it is that we disagree on. I mean, the invasion of Iraq was a massive catastrophe for the country that we never dealt with of a trauma of that loss of the tens of thousands of Americans. Forget the Iraqis, although that's a real thing. That's a real cost in the world. But internally, we never talked about the internal costs to America, to American blood, to American limbs, to American treasure, to the opportunity to take that trillion that we, or 2 trillion or 2.7 trillion or 3 trillion, whatever it was, that we buried in the sand of Mesopotamia, to take that and to do something like re-educate the American working classes, deindustrialized classes, or to create a middle class in Africa. I mean, there are opportunity costs. We had a couple of $1 trillion and we spent it on something stupid. The million dead Iraqis aside, and that is a real moral thing. But that aside, in terms of our own internal interests, once you put aside the suffering of people that we caused for no good reason, there are real opportunity costs for money and resources not spent, and internal trauma and anguish that American political society had to deal with after the loss of those two wars.
So here's where I think I can bring on Drew's opinions when it comes to what you guys will definitely disagree on. Because you guys agree on, even though Drew does not attribute as much stupidity as pre-planned or, like a lot of greed to a lot of these decisions in Iraq, be that as it may. If we move away from Iraq, which we could attribute to either one of those things or a bit of one or a bit of the other, if we look at the overall picture, the thing that a lot of the folks on 4chan are very concerned about, given the state of the world today, is the whole Great Reset business and the way that they see it. And again, this isn't me speaking, this is they speaking. The way that they see it is that it's not a bug, it's not an error, it's a feature that America right now is declining. So the way that they see it is that there is a controlled demolition of the entire Western sphere for the sake of having some kind of a top-down system where you're going to have all these people living in this very poor way, equally poor, while having the privileged elite at the very top. So that's the idea that a lot of people have today when it comes to all of these climate change related policies and the Great Reset, World Economic Forum, and that is the big bad today. The question is how much of that is also these elites being SJWs and just thinking that they're doing the right thing versus something much more organized.
Yeah, that's a great question. That is somewhere where Drew and I might actually disagree on. First of all, as a member of the Atlantic Council and as a paid up member of the blob, to the extent that I am, well, I don't live in Washington D.C. because I don't want to be there. I don't want to climb the steps to be a member of a national security council. I just don't it's not my ambition. It's not what I'm interested in. I don't want to be the head of a think tank. I don't want to be like a congressman. So I don't live in Washington D.C. Right? If I wanted those things, I would live there. But that aside, as a member of the quote unquote elite, to the extent that being a member of the Atlantic Council and going to conferences and reading white papers and writing white papers is what makes one a member of the elite. I believe that American power is actually good. I believe that a world run by Americans is the least worst possible world for everybody. I was born in Central Asia. I've seen the Russians up close. A world run by the Chinese or the Russians is not the world that I want to live in. The Americans, for all the problems, like the world liberal order, is American hegemony running NATO and American-run international structures. Americans should be running those structures. A world run by Americans is a better world for everybody, right? All the imperialism and hegemony and all that leftist nonsense aside, a multipolar world with the Iranians and the Chinese and the Russians and the Arabs are fighting for dominance and the Europeans are weenies declining is not a world I want to live in. The Europeans debased themselves in the Holocaust and World War II. They should not be running the world. They shot themselves. A world run by the nice people at Brookings and the State Department is better for everybody, right? I don't know if Drew agrees with that. But again, tweet Jack.
But they're not the Great Reset people. Just so we're clear, the Great Reset people actually want America, or at least in the mind of the people who hate them, they want America and the West in general to fail. So I don't equivocate them with America. But Drew, go on.
So yeah, so just to, I'll try and summarize, my viewpoint on. I wanted to bring this up. I think COVID specifically.
And be
there's
careful,
a couple
we're
of,
still on YouTube. We gotta
okay,
talking
yeah.
code.
Well,
Talking code.
the last few years, the events of the last few years. I think there's a couple. I think there's a couple of. I think there's a couple of. Oh, is my audio still coming in good?
Yeah.
Everything good?
Okay.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so I think in general, you just talked about the world order, the liberal world order, and of course in my hoodie conspiracy realms, the new world order is of course something that we talk about quite a bit. And of course, George Bush Sr. specifically said it in speeches multiple times, the exact phrase. So yeah, that's what I see. There is from my viewpoint, there is a coordinated, multi-generational goal to create a new world order, which is high concentration of wealth for the ruling class, and everybody else is living as minimally as possible, and the minimal amount of people are living, which is of course eugenics.
Brazil and North America. Argentina and Brazil and North America, right?
Wait, what was that?
I mean, the concentration of wealth. I mean, you're talking about bringing Brazilian style system to America, North America, and Europe.
Essentially, yeah.
Okay.
So how this all ties together, I think Skull and Bones is again a great example. Not to focus on them too much, but the Skull and Bones, their symbol, their insignia, they use the number 322 underneath the Skull and Bones in reference to 322 BC, where Athens turned from a democracy to a plutocracy. So,
Okay.
Changing from, a vote of, a voting society into a rule of the wealthy. And I think what's very important to that, and again, goes to my position as the elites are very coordinated. They have multi-generational malevolent intentions, which, I guess they could see as positive, but it's not positive for the people that they step on the way. And the core of that is eugenics and population control. So what I see happening is eugenics, of course, was the science of the day before World War II. The Nazis, of course, learned it from the U.S. The Rockefellers funded the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Eugenics in Germany. And then, of course, I believe in Mein Kampf, Hitler even says specifically he was basing his program off of what he observed of California's. I think specifically to tie it directly to Skull and Bones, and of course we've already talked about the connections. I think the last Skull and Bones member in the government was Steve Mnuchin, head of the Treasury, which is hilarious. On the dollar bills, he doesn't cursive; he prints his name, which is I think hilarious. But
why?
What's that?
Why is it hilarious? Why does he do that?
Because I have no idea why he does it, but it's just like I don't know. I find it funny that every dollar bill now that's printed, under the Trump administration, has an imprint.
Wait, you do understand he got that job randomly. I mean, right? I mean, like he was just like the random treasury guy. So Donald Trump was the head of a counter elite, like of random people, a confederation of losers. That's what a counter elite is. Outsider insiders are like a rich person with no access to power and grievances. He is a classic outsider who chafes to be an insider and is too vulgar and much of an outsider and doesn't know how to dress himself and behave himself to be an insider. And he has all these weirdos and amateurs inside his administration. And he also needs like a proper central banker. So he found the one guy who didn't insult him during the campaign. I think it's almost random that he got a Goldman Sachs banker in it, because he kind of ran against the finance capital people. I mean, as a proper Marxist corporatist, right? Represents industrial capital and a bunch of losers against Wall Street and the tech oligarchy, right? Steve,
Right, that was just kind of a complete side point. I was just trying to bring up that there is still outward Skull and Bone members in the relevant government. I'm just going to keep going forward because I just want to kind of get this and make sure it's a succinct point. So to connect, Skull and Bones, which centralization of power, very coordinated, very intentional, and very powerful. Historically, it's not a conspiracy theory to say that this group has held a lot of power.
Yeah.
Specifically, President Taft, who was a Skull and Bones member, after being president, he became the Supreme Justice of the Supreme Court, or the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And one of the major cases that he ruled on was Buck v. Bell, which basically legalized forced sterilization in the United States.
Yeah, weird stuff, man.
Yeah, so that's one example, and then of course their goal overall to be plutocracy, to have a rule by the wealthy, given that that's what the date that they referred to in their under their name. I see that goal and that same social group of ruling elites. They have that same negative. They have that same negative goal, and I see it tying into some of the social aspects that we talked about earlier, where back in the day, they would, thanks to Taft's ruling, they would forcefully sterilize children in California. And now we have California passing rules that allow for the chemical castration of children, and even taking them in as refugees from states that have banned the chemical castration of children.
But if I'm being a lawyer here, I just
psychosis, man. That's a social psychosis of swaths of the American ruling elite. That's decadence. That's like late Roman civilizational style decadence. Like that's Nero stuff. That's Caligula stuff, right? That's something that happens in like an advanced, screwed up psychosis society where ruling elites start to say that.
To be fair to Drew, though,
the social movements are, I think to some degree, I think we could agree that there are coordination of the media to push certain social trends, such as feminism back in the day, and there's a interview with Aaron Russo, who he talks about a discussion that he had with a Rockefeller family member where he says, "What do you think feminism was about?" Blah, blah, blah. And he's like, that was to get women in the workforce so we could tax them and then get their children into the schools exclusively, so that we could indoctrinate them. And that one interview is not necessarily proof of anything, but
Vlad, yeah,
it's a bit too pat. But go ahead.
No. When it comes to a lot of these things that Drew was mentioning, that would be, and I understand that we only have a limited amount of time, but in general, that would be an interesting thing to look at and say, okay, if this gentleman was talking about how feminism was partly done for this particular result, I wouldn't necessarily throw that away, right? Like, that would be a pretty big thing where I think, okay, so then maybe there were people who, regardless of whether they were around women's rights, that would have still been happening, but maybe they would have given it a little bit of an extra push if they saw that it would benefit them. So I'm not looking at this as being black and white. I could say, like, sure, we can have people who see a lot of this gender stuff happening, but maybe you could also have people within certain positions say, you know what, I like the way this is going. I'm going to help push it even further because of my own weird things. Like, I'm not saying that that's impossible either. What I want Drew to do, though, I don't know if you can do it or not. Do you have any receipts as far as certain things that members of the elites have said today, not like 50 years ago, not like during Taft's time, but today, when it comes to what they intend to do and why they intend on doing it? Because otherwise we'll keep going back.
Population control?
Sure, population control.
It's rebranded, So again, on the multi-generational thing, and something else we talked about earlier, which was the need to rebrand certain ideas. So obviously, eugenics pre-World War II completely acceptable. Everybody thought it was great. Scientific elite of the time, complete
Fad.
agreement. They
Bad, yes.
Yes,
well,
a
yeah,
fad.
sure. So after World War II, obviously the brand of
Yeah.
eugenics has degraded. So you had John Rockefeller III start the Population Council in the 1950s. What was his goal? Was to give was population control, which they had now had a whole new reason for. Before eugenics, they were just like, all right, get rid of the lower class, the infirm, et cetera, which happened to not be their own families.
Right.
But Population Council, at that point they had the idea of overpopulation, which they had come up with the idea after World War II. Before they didn't have a real overpopulation reason for eugenics, or maybe they did, but now was the focus. And they even in those later days, for instance, there's a February 1969 publication of the Population Council where they specifically mentioned that they were exploring involuntary sterilization methods.
Right.
They were talking about the third world, of course, but yeah, as we know, it's legal to do that in the United States as well. But
Like,
to
look,
kind of
this
sum
is
that
these
all
are
up.
historical weirdo. These are like historical weirdo psychosis. There are in American history, there are periods of psychosis starting from the very beginning of the country. You have Salem witch trials, right? The country
Yeah.
begins with like with a lot of people having like crazy
Do
ideas.
you not see population control as an overarching theme in our culture today, especially with people like Bill Gates? Do you think that's? I mean, I think that exact the institutions that
Exactly.
Rockefeller put in afterwards
Where do you see the ideology?
gave the basis for it.
Where do you see the population control ideology? Like, I'm open
Bill
to
Gates, his did you see his TED talk where that's always been one of his main goals
What did he
is
say?
population control.
What did he
Oh,
say?
he said through vaccinations will reduce child mortality, and that way people will have less children in the third world, and then we won't run into overpopulation. And the justification given is that it'll reduce the carbon imprint of the generation and help us through
First of all,
climate
there are
change.
too many of us. Like, there are too many of us, right? Like, obviously there are too many of us. Like, I walk around the street, they're like, "Why are all these people here? I hate these people. I don't like these people."
I hate traffic too.
And there's
for
nothing
sure.
wrong with being responsible as far as like if you're ready to have a family and if you can pass on good lessons to your kids instead of just like being a single mom in a drugged out household. Obviously, it would be better to have kids if you've got your shit together. Like that's I think obvious. The problem that I have with just Drew's take, but I do have something to back Drew up as well. So I'm of two minds here. The problem is that just by Bill Gates saying that, it's not enough if I put my lawyer hat on to say that's the same as involuntary fertility control. But to agree with Drew, partly there was that studies in family planning from the Population Control Council publication in February 1969, where they do have, I'm looking at it right now, it says B, establishment of involuntary fertility control, and then it says mass use of fertility control agent by government to regulate births at acceptable level. So there is something there. It's still not current. It's not today. It's like 1969.
I was just trying to show that.
Wait, one at a time. Vlad.
Sorry. Go ahead.
60 years ago, there was a fad of neo-Malthusianism. This happened. This was a fad. Like like in the same way that like trans stuff, the main.
They share objectives. No, they share outcomes.
No, I mean, like there are like in the same way that you could say the Salem witch trials were an American like psychosis localized in time and space, and California really like people they're making their Golgotha chemically sterilizing children, making that their main issue is a form of social psychosis, which the internet and cultism got them into. I mean, you could say those are both forms of American psychosis, Great American Berserk. But it's to say that it's part of the same ideology. I don't know, man.
Yeah, I mean the only other thing that I would give, and I don't want to focus too much on this because again, I really think these things would require, let's say, somebody like yourself, Vlad, some time to actually go in, look at the papers, compare them to contrary evidence, and I think it's kind of putting anybody on the spot just to say like, do I agree, do I disagree? If this is like the first time you're hearing certain things, right? But
that's right.
But that's
generous.
Yes, but that being said, I think what Drew is aiming at here, which I think is particularly interesting, not for now, but maybe for the future to take a look at, is that there are certain relationships with, let's say, people who were the heads of IBM and the parents of Bill Gates. Like, there are certain incestuous, let's say, relationships when it comes to certain people who know each other, who may, and I'm just saying may, I'm not saying 100%, pass on certain ways that they see the world to the next generation.
Okay, that's legitimate, but I just want to say this. The counter argument to you, Drew, is that now the thing that everybody's concerned about, and just read the newspaper, read the Financial Times, right? Mm-hmm. Last week, the Financial Times, they had a front cover page story, lowest birth rates in Italy since the Risorgimento, since 1861. And then you have all these learned people, doctors and people with demographic degrees writing into the Financial Times this week and saying it's actually the demographics are worse and the incentives are worse and then blah blah blah. Like the thing that elites are now worried about is declining birth rates to the point where post-industrial society doesn't have 2.1 children per woman. Blah blah blah. The Malthusian stuff is obviously there in history and that's real intellectual history, but that's not what you get when you open up the Financial Times in London or in Paris now. It's a bunch of elites worrying about not having enough workers and
at the same time as the rise of AI is about to wipe out a huge swath of white collar, so there's no longer necessary.
You're right, but like here in France, the elites are arguing about the need to make people work till 64. That's what the French are killing each other over right now in the streets. So they want to work till 62, and the elites are like, no, tax base requires you to work till 64, which is completely legitimate, by the way. It's like the Malthusian stuff is very last century, man. It's like this isn't what. Do
you think Bill Gates doesn't still have the same goal as he? So were you not aware that Bill Gates' big thing was always population control? He always that was the big purpose of his.
Bill Gates, man. I don't follow Bill Gates.
Okay, well, it was his main goal was to control population through positive methods.
But maybe like population in Africa, where people still live as if the last 1,000 years of technology and technological breakthroughs have not happened. Like there are parts of Africa where people still live in the 8th century AD, and it would be better for them if they had modern technology, and instead of having 14 kids, they had 4, and those kids were vaccinated and had education.
For sure. Yeah, I was just saying I was drawing the conclusion showing that it's still a relevant goal, and I agree. Now we're reaching the point where these various population control methods, turns out they were too effective, and now we have a whole different set of problems.
We do have a set of problems, Ben. It wasn't population control methods. It's like the combination of modernity, education, longevity, birth control for women, women's control.
What organizations were behind those? What organizations were behind the proliferation of birth control methods? And what organizations specifically in the United States helped with those, such as abortion and
I have a quick question for Drew. If those organizations didn't exist, do you think we would have had these same things happen or no?
As
far as feminism, as far as birth control, so there wouldn't be like an entrepreneur.
No, feminism and birth control are very tied together, 100%.
Well, that's interesting because like you wouldn't see that there being an incentive in terms of some capitalist structure for somebody to come around and say like, hey, I have this way that you guys could have sex without worrying about getting pregnant. Nobody would come around and do that without the aid of these surreptitious groups working behind the scenes. That's what I'm trying to...
I mean, yeah, sure, there's a market incentive. I'm just saying the people that ended up doing it were the same people that were obsessed with eugenics, and not in like a fun, positive way. Like giving birth control methods.
Okay,
but,
so here's how we can
but a
agree.
nasty involuntary sterilization. I just want to make this point about
Okay.
Planned Parenthood real quick.
Okay.
Which,
Please.
of course, Margaret Sanger, you can read some of her letters where she talks about like, oh, we want to make sure that, because she was very focused on giving birth control methods to the African American population of the United States. And
Yeah, this is well known. This is a well-known history, and you're right. I mean, it was
Exactly.
it was racism of its time, man. It was like
Mhm.
racism of its time. It's like
For sure.
small
And then there was a
group-
rebrand. But the goal and the objectives and the outcomes are very much. I'm sure Sanger would be very happy to see how things have played
Okay, well,
out.
here's how we can
I just want to make one
Okay.
connection, one more
Sure,
connection.
sure.
I mean, Gates' father also was in the leadership of Planned Parenthood in Washington. So I just wanted to make that connection.
Okay.
You're asking about where exactly are these connections? It's very straightforward. There is very generational, obvious organizations that have been behind the majority of the reasons why we are running into this depopulation crisis. And I think if we just go ahead.
Would
I'll
it be
leave there.
fair for both of you guys for me to say that, number one, certain economic factors and social factors like Vlad is talking about would
Right.
make it much more easier for there to be things like birth control and abortion and all that kind of stuff, while at the same time there could also be certain interests like Drew was talking about that could kind of push it along, give it a little boost, if you will. Like, I don't think that that's beyond the realm of possibility given what Drew was talking about when it comes to certain motivations. I just wouldn't attribute all these things specifically to the surreptitious people behind the scenes. I could say, like, sure, they may have pushed it, but these things I think still would have been around. And that brings me to the question of, given the whole Klaus Schwab, you will eat the box, you will live in the pod, all that stuff today with the Great Reset, how much of that do you guys see as being intentional pushing as opposed to just going with today's economics? Because what I'm really trying to find here is not really something like the population stuff, which could be attributed to, like I was talking about, just capitalist structures, but specific things that are artificially to a high degree being pushed, that if they were not pushed, if we were able to take all the elites that are pushing certain things of that nature, let's say, and arrest them, then it would stop. And I know I'm being a little bit too romantic about that, but you see how I'm sure.
It's been an hour and a half, and I have not yet played the elite card once. I've not yet done or said anything that would make you think anything.
Drop a few names. Do a little name dropping. Come on, we only got a few.
No. Even better than that, I just want to say that I don't want to. I'm going to do one thing that will put me on a different side of the barricades for the sake of sport, because Drew and I don't disagree on many things, actually.
We're too smart to disagree,
Yeah, but I just want to say that I'm not going to criticize Mr. Schwab because I don't want to be disinvited from Davos.
Have you gone?
No comment.
Well, you're our man on the inside then, Vlad. And it would be interesting to see how these things happen. But yeah, I mean, you see what I mean here when it comes to certain things that are much more pre-planned, that may not necessarily need to go that way when it comes to the way that culture is going. Because sure, culture can become much more liberal. We can open ourselves up to much more not so traditional types of living arrangements and marriages and things like that. But when it comes to things like, I don't know, like the 15-minute cities and various things having to do with climate change that are proposed, this is where I start getting a bit more concerned, because I do see, for example, with certain things like that, there being ideas having to do with, well, what if we have all of these people equally living in this very, habitat, however you want to form it, way, and we are going to still be the privileged with our airplanes and going around the world, while these people, for the sake of the climate, for all that stuff, they are now going to be below us. That I do not see as being a natural conclusion of a capitalist society, especially when we have things like nuclear plants, which Germany decided to get rid of, which I think would be able to solve so many of the problems, including dealing with Russia, for one thing. And yet we don't have an emphasis on nuclear at all. So that makes me think, what's going on here?
Nothing you just said would get you kicked out of 6 or 8 out of 14 Atlantic Council institutes.
I just thought of a great point, which might be able to get the needed conflict to really spice things up here.
Right.
Please,
Nord Stream pipeline. What's your take?
Okay, time for Ukraine. That'll be the last thing. Yes.
Well, look, I have a.
Who do you think did it?
I think the evidence does point to the fact that was the Americans letting some Ukrainian intelligence people do it. I mean, the Americans are not leaking it in the same way. When the Americans want to punish the Ukrainians for particular act that they don't like, they leak about it. So when they don't like the Ukrainians killing a particular person, they leak about it. When they think that the Ukrainians go too far with a particular operation, the American intelligence services will leak about it to the New York Times, the Washington Post. There's a pattern. We know when they keep things to themselves, they keep their cards real tight, close. When they're okay with it, they don't want to make the Ukrainians look bad because for obvious reasons, right? They want the Ukrainians to win. When Ukrainians go what they think is overboard, and they carry out operations that the Americans, let's say, don't think were necessarily correct, as in trying to kill Dugin in the middle of Moscow, they thought it was going too far, killing the daughter. They will leak information about who did it. In this situation, the American intelligence services have not leaked. So what's not known to me is more suggestive about what the Americans want known than what is known. That's my position.
Fair, Drew?
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. I mean, I would just straight up say it's obvious that the U.S. did it, and they want it so that there's no option for Germany to turn back the pipeline and start getting oil to start getting energy from Russia easily again. And I think them lying about it says everything.
By the way, just understanding what the LNG situation is and where the Germans are politically, it's not going to happen. It's not feasible, even if there's no going back. I don't think it's necessary for the.
If we get a cold winter next year instead of the abnormally hot one we got, what do you think happens with the energy situation in Germany?
The Germans will have LNG platforms in place. The energy will be very expensive and inefficient to import, but they will have the capacity to have 4.5 days out of a 5-day work week in order to keep industry running. By next year, they will have the situation one way or another resolved without Nord Stream 2. And they will it's not like we're really off the Russian crack pipe energy wise. Europe is really decreasing imports. It's just the Germans don't have a choice on this. They've got a gun to their head, and it's not the Russian gun at this point.
Now, I want to make sure, Vlad, how much time do you have left? Because I want to make sure we touch on Ukraine if there is still time here.
Give me 10 minutes. Yeah,
gotta go. All right, perfect. Yeah. And by the way, anybody, if you guys have any super chats, now is the time to need those super chats. So anyway, Drew, what would you like to ask Vlad specifically about Ukraine, where you see this whole origin of the war? Because Ukraine is something that's very close to Vlad's field of expertise.
Sure.
I mean, out of every recent event, I don't really have that much to say about Ukraine. I think the Nord Stream pipeline really shows that whole event, the fact that it happened. There's clear political motivation for one side to do it, where it was basically, it was pretty obvious what happened. But then the media still acted in a coordinated way to turn it into a conspiracy theory. And after the Biden laptop and the lab leak, that just really goes to show how much control there is over the media and how coordinated and not. It's the stupidity
we were down that road.
I do agree. I do agree that there's extremely stupid people in the elites. For instance, Hunter Biden was too busy smoking crack to go pick up his laptop. So that's an example of them being incompetent. And then
he's not a member of elite, man. He's like the spawn of a member of elite. This is the problem: is a lot of these people on Twitter are like the misbegotten, undereducated, overpromised, like dead-ender kids of a large elite with no cultural cohesion. I mean, like overproduction of elites is real. I mean, we all know this. And there's a lot of really unpleasant, nasty kids on Twitter who are really entitled and don't have anything in life. There's just Hunter Biden is the outcome of a nepotistic thing in Washington, D.C. It's a bipartisan problem, more a problem on the side of a Democratic Party. There's just a really, really nasty, bottom-sucking, bottom-feeding, nepotistic, oligarchic class of like Chinese-style princelings who are feeding off of their family connections. Hunter Biden, I wouldn't even call him. He's a member of the elite, but he hasn't done anything to me. I at least
for sure.
reporting.
Be the money man for Papa. Just they share bank accounts, etc., etc. But
that, I don't like that's never been proven. I don't think
I mean, there was the big guy thing. We still don't know who the big guy is.
For the big guy. Well, yeah, and his business partner was on TV saying, yes, the big guy, I can confirm that 100% means Joe. And
I don't.
It's just been completely ignored. But
I'm agnostic on all that. I was there. Hunter Biden is filthy, disgusting. That's not what's really important. What's really important is that Joe allowed this to happen. He was and Hunter was protected by the intelligence services and the State Department. All these people fucking. Can I curse a little bit?
Sure. Only after 15 minutes. Like before 15 minutes, you can't curse. After 15 minutes, go for it.
It's almost midnight. It's 2 minutes from midnight. I'm about to turn into a pumpkin. Like, what's disgusting is that Hunter Biden was like a representative of his class of disgusting children of people like John Kerry and all these people running around banking on their family names and just getting money for nothing and flying around on Air Force Two and being
chicks for free.
Well, I mean, like
the song, the song "Money for Nothing," chicks for no. Okay.
Yeah. And what's disgusting is that Biden didn't do anything about it, and the arrogance of this entire class of people, an entire apparatus of. You think like I'm a Ukraine hand. I spent the last 10 years of my life in and out of Ukraine. You think we didn't all know about this in 2017? You think the intelligence services didn't know about this? You think a lot of people weren't covering up for Hunter Biden? You think
so? The elite are coordinated and morally bad.
Fuck. I mean,
whoa! We did it.
10 points to Drew, I guess. I don't know.
Drew, you drew blood at the end of this argument. I mean, the intelligence services and all these people,
the media too, obviously.
Absolutely. I mean,
and the coordinated response, not even that, the coordinated response of all the tech companies all at once shows the complete. I mean, they have so much control. It's almost unbelievable.
No, but the bigger question here, and this is something that I keep going back to on Break the Rules, and I did that with Curtis Yarvin as well, is let's say we assume all these bad things about the elites are true. There is still an order of operation as far as how do you respond to Vladimir Putin, who's going to be taking over this piece of territory. Do you help? Do you not help? And what are going to be... Well, before we get into that, what are the repercussions if you don't help? And this is my problem with a lot of people who I agree on a lot with when it comes to the problem of the American middle class and all of these nefarious things that the elites are doing. I don't think that they've thought this through as far as, okay, let's say we don't help Ukraine, Russia acquires Ukraine, Ukraine, what happens next? How is this going to affect the entire state of the world? And I think that they think that once Putin gets Ukraine, it's all Gouda. He's just going to stop there, and everything is going to be nice and peaceful. Do you agree? Disagree with that statement, Vlad?
I mean, of course, those people are stupid. I mean, of course, those people are like, I'm a hawk at the Atlantic Council, man. Like, I'm a Ukraine hawk. I personally got my family out as refugees out of Ukraine. My family live in Odessa. I burn up my Russian passport live on. I burnt it live on CNN with the president of Estonia, Ilves Tumas, holding the lighter, man. Like, of course, I'm a total hawk on Moscow. Like, of course. We should give 4% of American GDP to Ukraine right now because they are fighting the good fight. Like everything, every penny that we could give from the U.S. Treasury, every weapon should be sent to Ukraine right now, short of nukes. Everything, like the entire U.S. Army, should disarm and just send everything over to Kiev right now.
Drew, you're skeptical.
Obviously that's a pretty wild series of statements. I feel like you might have been playing up a little bit, but you're from there. So.
No, I don't think it's about being from there. I think it's about what are the repercussions of not doing it at that level. That's really the question here. Because if we were to say, and again, this is going to be very bad of me, Vlad, I apologize. This is like if I'm going to be completely Machiavellian here, just like completely realpolitik, and say, if I can say 100% that if Putin acquires Ukraine and will go no further, then it's a different story as far as what America thinks would be the best way forward here. Would you disagree?
That's an intelligent way of thinking about it. Like, what if that was the case, and if that were truly the realist case, and it's not. That's absolutely not the case. If this happens, there will be world-changing consequences all across the board. If Ukraine falls and the Americans are not able to prop it up, and the liberal world order is not able to prop up the security architecture of Eastern Europe, everything else changes. China, all these revisionist powers will go full at it. I mean, this really is a world historical pivot moment of fighting for the system, right? But if that was not the case, would it be rational to let Ukraine go? Is your question, right?
Yes.
Drew, ask.
So again, guys, I don't want to. This is really far out of my competency area, but to my understanding, just from my viewpoint, from what I know, and I'm looking forward to hopefully you can correct me if I'm wrong, but to my knowledge, basically, well, first of all, I believe there was supposed to be peace negotiations, and then Boris Johnson flew in and prevented that. From my viewpoint, from what I've heard, the main problem here is that Russia wants Crimea. How do you say it? Crimea.
Krim is the proper word, but yeah.
So they want the warm water seaport or whatever, and to my knowledge, hasn't Zelensky been bombing that area, been bombing like Russian loyalists in that area against a treaty he signed after the 2014 or not him, but wasn't there a ceasefire that the Ukrainians broke?
Okay, so let me clear all that up. And those are it's a combination of one misinformation and one thing which needs to be cleared up. So there were immediately in the early days of the war, there were feelers of peace negotiations in Belarus, and there were early talks about negotiations in the first 3 weeks of the war. They went nowhere, and the Russians didn't want to stop. That's one thing. Two, after Ukrainians found all those dead bodies in Irpin and Bucha, there was no longer any interest in negotiating from the side of a population. You have 86% of a population that wants to continue fighting, And then you have 90% of the population, interestingly enough, that wants to make no territorial concessions. The Ukrainian population is livid, full of rage, and on war footing. This is 9 out of 10 Ukrainians want to continue fighting. What the government wants and what the government is capable of, and what the army wants is, in one way, immaterial. The Ukrainian people want to continue fighting. That's one thing. Two, as the status quo was, the Russians already had Crimea before this. A lot of people are operating under false assumptions that the Russians actually wanted two provinces, or they wanted Donetsk and Lugansk. What they want, and by the Russians I mean the Kremlin and Putin, is an end to the Ukrainian national project. They cannot have an independent Ukraine going forth in the world and getting rid of Russian domination. Their basic assumption is wrong. By they I mean, and these people who make wrong assumptions. The Russians do not want the Ukrainian state to exist. They tried to destroy Ukraine as a political project on February 24th, 2022. I was there. They had a full-scale invasion with not enough troops, with bad logistics, with bad arms, combined arms force, with not a great strategy, with not enough troops, etc., etc. But they tried to destroy the Ukrainian state a year ago. They wanted one thing, which is to depopulate, to destroy Kiev, take over the state, kill Zelensky, send his government to exile, cleave the country in two, let Lviv run itself as a rump state, maybe, and to occupy 75% of Ukraine and keep it as a country. This was their starting offer. As the Ukrainians won battle after battle, they have lesser capacity to do things, so they've curtailed their wartime aims. But basically, they've gone all in on destroying Ukraine. So that's one thing. There was the Minsk Accord and the Minsk II Accord. Well, the Minsk I Accord was signed in summer of 2014, when the Russian regular army invaded to stop the Ukrainians from taking back all the territory from the Russian-backed separatists and Russian-led separatists and Russian-led uprising in the east. The Ukrainians were winning battle after battle, and the Russians invaded in August of 2014 to take that territory back. That's what happened. Then Poroshenko, seeing that the Ukrainian army was about to get smashed, signed the Minsk I Accord, but the fighting continued. Minsk II was signed in February of 2015. Again, I was in Kiev. I was there. It was signed under the barrel of a gun, with the Ukrainian army surrounded by the Russians. They were eventually destroyed, and a couple of thousand of them died. And the Ukrainians and the Russians signed a very flawed ceasefire deal that had no sequencing for the way it was supposed to be initiated. The Russians were supposed to give up control of the border. The Ukrainians were supposed to have elections on their territory, and there were numerous other things. Minsk II was again hastily signed and cobbled together by the Germans and the French, Merkel and Hollande, and Putin and Lukashenko in Minsk, and Poroshenko was there also. It had no sequencing for the way it was supposed to be implemented. The 2022 was Putin trying to get the Ukrainians to implement Minsk II under the barrel of a gun, but he was never willing to give up the territory of the LNR, DNR to the Ukrainians before they were going to have elections under Ukrainian law. So that's what you have to understand. The sequencing of events was not popped into Minsk II. There was never going to be like an end to the conflict. Mm-hmm. Either the Russians were going to invade, or you would have kind of a ceasefire that lasted forever. This was compellence on the side of the Russians, in the sense that every year the Ukrainian army got stronger and stronger, the Ukrainian civil society got stronger and stronger. Every year the Russians had less and less leverage on internal Ukrainian politics. So eventually Putin saw that with every year it was going to be harder and harder, and he said, screw it. And he went all in to destroy the Ukrainian political state in order to get rid of his little problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think just I think I think we're pretty much done here. But just one other thing, just to give you my perspective on it. Again, you're obviously much more well read up on it than I am. I just say, from my perspective, I see NATO, constantly gaining more member states. And again, I believe they agreed not to do that, not to continue to expand NATO closer and closer to Russia's border.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's a talking point you hear a lot. There was never anything written on paper. There were conversations about that, which were never written down anywhere in the early '90s, and with the Soviets, which were never written down anywhere. There were. I mean, there was
Okay.
never any formal promise anywhere on paper. Unlike the Budapest Accords of 1994, where the Russians promised not to invade Ukraine. I mean, with nuclear weapons, NATO's not that big of an issue for Russia. NATO is a defensive alliance; it doesn't invade people. And sadly, the only countries that were left out of NATO when the Soviet Union dissolved, which is Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine, promptly got invaded by Russia. And the ones that were not on the other side of it, like
Finland?
Armenia and Azerbaijan, went to war with each other. Finland had Finlandization, and they had like Finland is a specific thing, but if you look at the 5 parts of the world that were not integrated into military alliances when communism, both in Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, collapsed in '91, they were Yugoslavia. They promptly went to war against each other, killing 250,000 people and spending the next 20 years killing each other. It was Armenia and Azerbaijan, which had multiple wars over the last 20 years. Moldova, promptly invaded in '92 by the Russians and partitioned and used as a security leverage against the Europeans and the Romanians and the Ukrainians on our border. And Ukraine, which was fiddled with, internally manipulated, bought off for 20 years until they couldn't do it anymore, at which point they invaded it. And Georgia also invaded and territory annexed. So what happens when your country is not protected by a military alliance from Russia is that Russia invades it. This is what Russia does. I'm sorry to say. That's a fact of life.
Well, I always compare Russia in that way to a lot of leftists, where if you don't defend certain institutions, then eventually they are going to get taken over by leftists. So I don't know if that's the best comparison here, but I do kind of see Russia as being one of these things where whatever you allow Russia to take, Russia's going to take. And when it comes to that...
Russia's an imperial state. That's what Russia does since the 18th, 17th, 18th century. Russia is an expansionary imperial state, and anything that's not nailed down, they will invade. Yeah. This is their political culture.
Well, to the other view, they would say that, and I don't want to speak for Drew over here, but in general, the fear that people have of NATO expanding is that they would say, well, maybe one day NATO is going to take over Russia, and at that point, they are going to start having rainbow and the trans flags everywhere. And they think that other Eastern European nations, which I personally think have been vaccinated via being under the USSR communism for quite a while, a lot of the more dissident people think that those places are eventually also going to fold and become very SJW leftist friendly. And I don't know if that's the case or not, but that's kind of like the concern these people have when it comes to an expansion of United States hegemony, is that with that, a lot of these nations that are sovereign right now, or they would say, well, they'd call them puppet states of the U.S., they would say that eventually those places are also going to be taken over by this radical ideology, and that's going to be a lot worse for people in comparison to a multipolar world where other forces, be it China or be it Russia, could exert their more trad principles, something like that.
Yeah, that's all nonsense. I mean, like the Poles and the Hungarians are full member states of the European Union. They're pretty conservative. I mean, like no one tells them how to. In fact, they're doing what they like. And
they'll say for now, wait until we get the professors in there, and we'll sneak them in. And I don't know.
Hungarians are doing okay keeping the professors out. Like they're making fun of Judith Butler is a Hungarian national pastime. They don't need our help with that. They're fine. Like it's fine. Like it's there's something like quote unquote global homo. Like I know that I'm not even allowed to use that word.
I don't think you can print that in the Atlantic
This
Council.
is such a weird stream. I just want to acknowledge what's going on here. Vlad Davidson from the Atlantic Council is using 4chan memes.
I do not want to jeopardize my job. As these people on the internet refer to it as global homo, which I'm not saying because I'm a reasonable member of the American political elite and I'm a member of the Atlantic Council. But some people I know refer to it as global homo, which I'm not doing because I do not legitimize that kind of language. But I know some people do refer to it as global homo. And
well, homo is meaning homogenization. That's what it means. So
yes, global homogenization, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to homosexual. But by the way, I'm all for like bisexual orgies in the Hungarian parliament, what they have, that Hungarian MP that got kicked out of Fidesz for getting caught in that gay orgy in Brussels. That's just Hungarian tradition. That's just fine. That's that's where the Western European decadence meets Eastern European intransigence. Those are traditional values, right? Okay. So global homogenization. I mean, this has nothing to do with what we're fighting for in Ukraine. We just want to be normal. We just want to live a normal life and not.
Well, I guess it all comes down to, for me, and this is gonna be the last thing here. It all comes down to when things get easier, when you're not fighting against an enemy, or when you run out of the fumes of the times when you had some kind of pressure on you. I think that there is going to be a tendency to soften because there's nothing to push against, and that's going to create a lot of the things that we're seeing today, which is why, sure, I could see a potential where Poland and all these other countries go through similar things. The question, though, is how do we get out of that? I don't think we get out of that by having a top-down dictatorial system that now has all of this AI and technology that it can use to solidify power even more, and a lot of ass-kissers around this potential leader. I don't think that's the way out. But I don't know. That's a conversation for a different time, and we keep coming back to the same thing.
Here's the thing. I think there are a lot of very reasonable people on the conservative side and the Michael Lind leftist side, people in particular vectors of the Sanders left who don't disagree with us on lots of things. And I think you could even have a variant of this conversation with a lot of very reasonable people in Washington, D.C. I thought this would be a much more. I really thought this would be much more career dangerous for me.
No, but you see, Vlad, this is why I really enjoy Drew's side of Twitter, because they bring up a lot of things that I think a lot of the people in the Atlantic Council and other think tanks, when they get together for drinks, they would agree on. But there are certain things, let's say, certain ways that people conduct themselves in polite society, where I think certain aspects of those ends up getting blocked. And I think it's a very important thing, especially today, to have an outlet like Break the Rules, where people can get together from these different sides and be able to engage like this.
You're absolutely right. But here's the thing: a lot of that bureaucratic language, thought crime, conformism is more on the left. It's harder to say these things on the left. There's more control of language that comes from kind of a censorious, priggish, puritanical SJW left.
Yeah, isn't it ironic how that's switched? How traditionally the right has been the conservative, censoring offensive things, and now from a religious aspect, and now we have somewhat a secular version of that, where there is no necessarily a god, but they have
Mm.
Well,
things
they
they
are the
worship.
new clerisy. They are the new clerisy of new bourgeois consensus, in the sense that, like, they are the bourgeois. Like the prim speech codes are like bourgeois speech codes.
Yeah.
Like,
But it's so lame. Why are all the Gen Z kids, or a lot of them, and Gen Alpha, why are they with all of that? Because it seems like they do listen to those dumb TikTok influencers.
There's a pendulum swing happening right now.
there's a pendulum swing happening, but I have to tell you, there are a lot of people in various think tanks. You would have allies who think like you, and who think you're very reasonable people and very reasonable gents. And you would have, just like Donald Trump had all sorts of support in radically surprising places. You two gentlemen, with your consensus and your ideas, would have all sorts of people in Washington D.C. who don't like certain parts of the pervasive culture of the managerial liberal elites, progressive and not liberal, progressive managerial elites. You would have surprising allies. There would be all sorts of interesting people who would not necessarily come on your show, but would not disagree with you on a lot of things.
Well, not come on the show yet. I mean, there's room for certain alliances to be formed eventually with Break the Rules, one step at a time. I've been contacting a few people here and there, so you guys are going to be in for quite the surprise with the months ahead. But anyway, thank you guys so much for coming on. This Friday, we are not done yet, Drew. This is Drutang Week on Break the Rules. We are going to have Drew back with the great and powerful Gnostic informant, my good friend Neil, and we are going to be talking about more of the esoteric side of this whole thing, something we didn't really get into today, having to do with like the Freemasonry and the aerospace industry, having connections to a lot of these mystery cult traditions. It's interesting stuff. It's a very different flavor of stream, but it's also something that I personally think is worth looking into, just because I don't see myself as a materialist.
Enjoy yourself on that end of things, gents. That's somewhere where
Vlad, you can sit this one out.
I'm gonna sit this one out. I got a
All right. Vlad, where can people find you? I'm
on Twitter. I wrote a book called From Odessa with Love. I have another book called The Birth of a Political Nation coming out. It's about Ukraine and Jews and Russian propaganda and historical arguments or historical debates. You could find me all over the internet. I'm on Twitter. I write for Foreign Policy magazine. I write a column for Tablet magazine, which is a wonderful magazine. I'm not hard to find. Follow me on Twitter and follow my stuff. And if you're interested in my stuff, my books are on Amazon.com. Gents, I've had a really lovely time. Thank you for inviting me on.
Same here. Thank you so much for coming in, Vlad. I hope to see you very soon.
All
right.
See you, Vlad. Thanks.
Now let me change the screen and let us do the promotion for yourself, Drew. That was a really interesting stream. I was not prepared for it to go as smoothly as it did, so I'm happy about that. Like, I'm happy that there was a lot of common ground that was able to be found between you and Vlad.
I got him to admit it at the end, right?
Oh, there we go. And the Ukraine stuff as well in there, because I really do think that the circle that you are in, the circle that he is in, there is way more overlap than we initially think. But people usually don't have time to go outside of their norm, which is understandable. Like, it's the algorithm as well. Like, whatever pops up on your Twitter timeline is usually going to be things of the people who you've already spoken with. So that is kind of like the change that I want to start making with Break the Rules, where I would be able to bring in somebody from a completely different social circle, have those circles overlap, and that
the tweed suit and the hoodie. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And that way I think we can actually train ourselves. Like, I think this is all spiritual, going back to the whole stream we're going to have with Elon Musk about, not with Elon Musk, I mean, who knows, but...
Do it faces, he'll probably jump in.
Hell yeah. I think that there is a spiritual dimension to all of this as well, where we have these two columns of severity and mercy, and we have to kind of like go in between those columns and figure out a way to balance things out. But that's all we're going to be talking about on Friday. Are you a Christian, by the way?
Yes, I would consider myself a Christian, yeah.
So then it would be a very interesting topic, especially because of a lot of the things that Neil brings up regarding the founding of America, having to do with, like, I mean, all this stuff too, like with the Freemasonry and all that. So we will definitely get into it, and it'll be a very interesting discussion. That's going to be 5 p.m. this Friday. You guys are going to see the link right after this stream concludes. Drew, where could all the good people find you, and tell us about American Apocalypse and what that's all about?
Awesome. Yeah. So I'm on Twitter at Drutang Reborn. It's DRU Tang TANG Reborn REBORN. And yeah, my new book American Apocalypse X is going to be coming out shortly. I'm announcing the pre-order page tomorrow.
Nice.
And yeah, it's basically, it's a culmination of what I see as the kind of the finale in a way of American dominance, in referring to apocalypse. But I think most importantly, my goal with the book is the true meaning of the word apocalypse is just the Greek word meaning revelation, which is just a great revealing. And so what we think of as the end of the world is really, in a way, is just going to be a revealing of things that have been there the whole time. So that's the goal of the book. It's basically, it's going to be covering kind of how patterns repeat, how narratives are set up, how throughout time, culture of course, mythology is always used to legitimize rule. So, of course, the pharaohs said they were sons of Ra or Horus, Osiris. And then, of course, we have the Christian kings ruling by divine right. And all those things, the reason why those societies were able to be ruled was because there was a mythology. And our current oligarchy, plutocracy that we're leaning into, which they want to brand as a technocracy, we're very much being programmed to accept the idea that these certain leaders are there again by a new type of divine right, which is superpowers. That's the mythology of America since World War II, kind of in a Nietzschean way, where in the end of Christianity, you need an Ubermensch for people to idolize and look up to. And those are being supplied to us through our various billionaire, millionaire leading rulers and through social media.
They're kind of pathetic Ubermensch, though, if we're talking about, like, I don't think they were able to exert a lot of Kundalini energy, but that's just my point of view there. So they're not stepping up to what I see as the ideal, which is kind of the shame of it too, in a way, right? Like, you'd expect there to be like an Ubermensch who's actually embodying some of those qualities, but here's these losers.
That's kind of the thing, though, is that the Ubermensch is the archetype of the Superman, literally Superman. So we have Captain America in the Marvel universe, and we have Superman himself.
Oh yeah,
DC, and then you have the transhumanist superheroes, which don't have any technical, spiritual enlightenment. They have complete transhumanist technology.
So like Iron Man, that would be the
and Batman.
big one.
Yeah, so those two. Those are but it's the same mythology. It's the same mythology told over and over again. And it goes all the way back to Egypt as well. And basically the book is I believe if we can show everybody the kind of script that's being run over and over again in civilizations, and especially at the turning point of civilizations, when you take one empire and you roll it into a new one, there is a certain process, a ritual based on Osiris that has been repeated quite a few times. And by showing what's going on to people, I think we can get rid of the political divisions. We can get rid of the ideology or the, worshiping of certain figures. And if you can see the script, then I think people will be able to work together a lot better, and we can prevent a lot of negative things from happening in civilization.
Heaven, yeah. Drew, thank you so much, brother, for coming in. And I hope that you are going to be able to recite the same thing at the table of the Atlantic Council, given a few years. These are the connections we're already making. Yeah, no, I really think that people are very curious about this kind of stuff, especially if you're living a life of like this stuffy, regimented, handshaking, wearing the suit and all that. Like, I could definitely see there being way more people who are going to be very interested in your book who are from that realm, and hopefully we've planted the seed for that. For all of the Atlantic Council people who are watching this right now, get Drew's book right now. You can do it under a pseudonym or whatever. I don't care. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. You could find me at LevPo on Twitter. This Friday, check it out. American Apocalypse. We're going to be talking about Elon Musk, whether he's a Satanist or not. That's like a catchy title.